They thought I would never find out. They thought I was a fixed point in the cosmos, a predictable planet in a stable orbit around the brilliant, burning sun that was my wife, Claire. They thought my world was small, my vision limited to the four walls of our tastefully decorated suburban home and the bland, fluorescent-lit corridors of a mid-level management job. They thought wrong. The thought that became my mantra, the line I rehearsed in the silent, pre-dawn hours, was this: they thought I'd never find out, until I walked in as the new investor. I stood before the mirror that morning, the silk of my tie a cold, constricting presence against my throat. My reflection was a stranger I was slowly coming to know, a man whose face had been recarved by a grief so profound it had hardened into something else entirely, something cold, quiet, and patient. For weeks, I had been an unwilling archaeologist, excavating the ruins of my own marriage. The artifacts were fragments of late-night texts glimpsed over her shoulder, their blue light painting her face in the colors of deceit. They were hushed phone calls in the other room, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur that would cease the moment I entered. They were business trips that stretched a day, then two, longer than they should, leaving a void in our bed and a cold knot of suspicion in my gut. Claire wasn't just unfaithful, she was insulated. She had built a fortress of lies, and her entire office served as its garrison. They were her co-conspirators, the smiling sentinels who guarded her secret. At company dinners, they would clap me on the shoulder, ask about my weekend, their eyes glinting with a shared, secret knowledge that made me feel like a court jester in a kingdom of whispers. They covered for her with the practiced ease of seasoned liars, their professional courtesies a thin veneer over a bedrock of contempt. The truth, when it came, did not arrive as a tearful confession or a damning photograph slipped under my door. It arrived as an opportunity, a cosmic alignment of betrayal and ambition that was so perfectly, brutally ironic. It felt like the punchline to a joke the universe had been telling at my expense. I had spent years building a private equity portfolio under a series of holding companies, a quiet empire of assets and influence that was my world, a world I had deliberately kept separate from the one I shared with Claire. I wanted to be loved for the man, not the balance sheet. One of my firms was approached about acquiring a controlling share in a mid-sized marketing agency called Nexus Creative. The name was vaguely familiar. A quick search, and the blood in my veins turned to ice. It was her company, the one where she was a rising star, the one where the charismatic CEO, Marcus Thorne, had become her mentor. Suddenly, the fractured pieces of the last few months clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The late nights weren't just about projects. They were about him. The business trips weren't for clients. They were for him. Her entire professional ascent was inextricably linked to her personal descent. I didn't hesitate. There was no internal debate, no agonizing over the moral complexities. There was only a cold, clear, and immediate path forward. The deal was finalized in a matter of days. I bought in. All of it. I remember the silence when I walked into that conference room for the first time. It was a Tuesday morning. The senior team was gathered for their weekly strategy meeting, a casual affair of coffee and croissants. They knew a new investor was coming, but my name had been deliberately kept off the memos. They expected a faceless corporate entity, not the husband they had all been so diligently deceiving. The silence was not just an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. Claire froze mid-laugh, a story she was telling a junior associate dying on her lips. Her glass of water paused halfway to her mouth, a small tremor in her hand sending ripples across its surface. Marcus Thorne, the CEO, the mentor, the architect of my humiliation, was holding a pen that stopped moving across his notepad. Evelyn Reed, the HR director, a woman who had once sent me a Christmas card, stood so quickly that a stack of papers slid from her grasp and scattered across the polished mahogany table. My footsteps were the only sound, the soft, expensive click of my leather shoes on the floor in indictment with every step. Every eye followed me as I crossed the room to the head of the table, the seat opposite Marcus. Evelyn, her face pale, hastily gathered the scattered papers and placed a thick, heavy file in front of me. It landed with a soft, definitive thud, a sound like a judge's gavel in a silent courtroom. I didn't open it. Not right away. I let it sit there, a monolith of documented betrayal. I wanted them to feel it. I wanted every single person in that room. The ones who had lied to my face, the ones who had whispered behind my back, the ones who had chosen the convenience of silence over the difficulty of integrity, to feel the cold, heavy dread that had been my constant companion for months. My eyes didn't need to skim the contents. I knew what was inside. I had spent the entire previous night committing it to memory. Photographs from a private investigator, capturing Claire and Marcus leaving a boutique hotel in wine country. Expense reports detailing lavish dinners for two, billed to the company as client entertainment. Hotel bookings under Marcus's name, with Claire listed as the second guest, their intertwined signatures on company travel authorizations, a grotesque parody of intimacy. Finally, when the silence had been stretched to its absolute breaking point, I spoke. The words were quiet, but they landed like hammer blows. I own the company. The air in the room didn't just shift, it fractured. A few of the younger employees looked down, suddenly fascinated by the weave of the carpet. Others stared at Claire, their expressions a cocktail of shock, pity, and a dawning, predatory curiosity. And Claire? She just sat there, the blood drained from her face, her mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, no words coming out. For the first time in her life, she had no script. There was no charming excuse, no tearful performance that could win her sympathy here. I remained silent, letting her drown in the exposure. I had carried this secret, this pain, alone for so long. Now it was no longer mine. It belonged to the entire room. It was their burden to bear, their complicity to confront. The truth was a contagion, and I had just released it into the wild. The silence in that conference room was a living entity, a predator stalking the space between us. It fed on the nervous energy, on the unspoken accusations, on the thick, cloying atmosphere of guilt. I could hear the second hand of the wall clock, each tick a small, sharp blow against the anvil of the quiet. Claire, my brilliant, confident, always in control Claire, was not accustomed to being a spectator in her own downfall. At home, our arguments were a dance she choreographed, a ballet of deflections and tearful pirouettes that always left me dizzy and questioning my own perceptions. But this was not our home. This was her stage, and I had just seized control of the production. I let the file sit, a dormant volcano of evidence. I had no need to erupt. The threat of it was enough. The night before, I had sat in my study, the contents spread across my desk, each page a fresh wound. The hotel folios from Napa, dated on the exact weekend she had tearfully told me she had to attend a mandatory corporate retreat. The receipts from a restaurant so expensive it made my stomach clench, time-stamped at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, she had supposedly been working late to meet a deadline. The emails, forwarded to me by a disgruntled IT employee Evelyn had pointed me toward, where the language shifted from professional platitudes to a cloying, coded intimacy. Can't wait for the next strategy session, Marcus had written. Asterisk, I have a few positions I'd like to explore with you. Asterisk, it was all there. A meticulous, damning record of their recklessness. Evelyn Reed, the HR director, had handed me the file with a look of grim resignation. Perhaps it was a final, desperate act of self-preservation, a calculated decision to align herself with the new nexus of power. Or perhaps, after years of enabling Marcus's behavior, her conscience had finally staged a coup. It didn't matter. She had given me the keys to the kingdom. Claire cleared her throat, a small, desperate sound in the cavernous silence. She was trying to reclaim the narrative, to find a foothold in the landslide. This isn't what it looks like, she stammered, the words a pathetic, reflexive lie. The tremor in her voice stripped the statement of all credibility. A few of the senior associates, the ones who had been with the company for years, exchanged glances. One of them, a man named David whom I'd met at several holiday parties, let out a quiet, contemptuous scoff. He had been one of her most loyal lieutenants, a man who had once assured me with a friendly smile that Claire was just burning the midnight oil on a big project. Loyalty, I was learning, was merely a function of power. I leaned back in my chair, the plush leather groaning softly. I folded my hands on the table, a deliberate, calming gesture I had seen men far more powerful than me use to command a room. Claire, I said, my voice even, almost detached, as if discussing a quarterly report. For 7 years, I trusted you implicitly. For the last 6 months, I believed you. I believed the work trips, the late nights, the client emergencies. I gave you every opportunity, every silent plea in my heart, for you to tell me the truth. I tapped the file, a single, sharp rap of my index finger. The sound was like a gunshot. But you didn't. And now, the truth is no longer a private matter between us. It's here, in black and white, on company letterhead, with a room full of witnesses. A blotchy, red flush crept up her neck, a telltale sign of her rage and humiliation. Her eyes, for a fleeting moment, darted toward Marcus Thorne. He sat at the opposite end of the table, a king dethroned, his posture rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. He, the master of every room he entered, was utterly, completely silent. He knew, with the cold certainty of a seasoned predator who has finally been trapped, that his career now rested in the hands of the man he had so casually cuckolded. The other employees were no longer spectators at a tennis match. They were potential casualties in a war zone. They weren't just afraid for Claire, they were terrified for themselves. Their lies, told to protect her, had now implicated them. Do you remember the Christmas party 2 years ago? I continued, my gaze sweeping across the room, letting it land on David, then another senior manager named Jessica. I came to pick Claire up. You all told me she was in a last-minute meeting with a client from out of town. I found her coat still on the rack in her office. You laughed and said she must have been in such a hurry she forgot it. My voice grew colder, sharper with each recalled deception. Or that time in March, when her car broke down and I called her office to see if she needed a ride. Jessica, I said, my eyes locking onto hers. You told me she had just stepped into a strategy session and couldn't be disturbed. A strategy session that somehow lasted until midnight. I let the weight of their complicity settle over them. I believed you, I said, the words heavy with the ghost of my own foolishness. Every single one of you. And now, I finally understand why. Claire's hands trembled. The tears hadn't come yet. She was still fighting, her pride a final, desperate defense. But the walls were closing in, the air growing thin. Even if she could somehow salvage our marriage, she could never salvage this. She could never unwrite the judgment in the eyes of the people she had to work with every day. Marcus, finally sensing that his silence was being interpreted as guilt, shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon his old, commanding presence. Perhaps, he began, his voice a low rumble of attempted authority, we should discuss this, privately. This is hardly a matter for the entire team. On the contrary, Marcus. I cut him off, my tone as sharp and clean as a surgeon's blade. This is exactly a matter for the team. For years, you have used this company as your personal fiefdom. You have blurred the lines between professional conduct and personal indulgence. You have made every employee in this room, wittingly or not, complicit in your choices. I leaned forward, my voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. I'm here to make one thing perfectly clear. That ends. Today. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. A young man in the corner was scribbling furiously in a notepad, his face a mask of horrified fascination. The spell was broken. The emperor had been revealed to have no clothes, and the courtiers were finally seeing him for the naked, pathetic man he was. Claire finally snapped. The dam of her composure broke. So what now? She demanded, her voice rising, cracking with a hysterical edge. You've humiliated me. You've made your point. What do you want? Do you want me to get on my knees and beg for forgiveness in front of everyone? Her words were meant to be a challenge, a final, defiant roar. But the tears that now streamed down her face betrayed her utter desperation. I didn't answer immediately. I let her question hang in the air, a raw, bleeding thing. I wanted every person in that room to contemplate it, to understand that this was not a simple domestic dispute. This was a reckoning. Finally, I leaned forward again, my voice low, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. What I want, Claire, I said slowly, is the truth. Not for me. I'm well past needing it from you. But for every employee who has had to lie for you. For every subordinate who has been afraid to speak up. For every dollar of this company's money that was spent to fund your affair. I paused, letting my gaze sweep the room one last time before settling back on her. The truth doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to all of us. Her tears flowed freely then, silent and hot, a river of shame. Marcus shifted again, a trapped animal looking for an escape that didn't exist. He was a calculator. I could see it in his eyes, frantically trying to compute the damage, to find an algorithm for survival. He didn't realize yet that I had rewritten the entire operating system. Evelyn, the HR director, finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, and utterly merciless. "The documents speak for themselves," she said, her tone clinical. She nodded at me. "As of this morning, Mr. Miller is the controlling investor. All decisions regarding corporate conduct and leadership fall under his authority." She then looked directly at Claire, her expression devoid of all sympathy. And by extension, so do the consequences. The room was no longer just a conference room. It was a courtroom, a crucible, a battlefield where a war that had been fought in whispers was now being concluded in the stark, unforgiving light of day. I didn't need to smile. I didn't need to gloat. There was still so much more to come, and Claire, for the first time in her brilliant, calculating life, had absolutely no idea what my next move would be. The silence that followed Evelyn's pronouncement was different. It was the silence of acceptance, of a verdict rendered. He tried one last gambit, appealing not to me, but to the room. "Look," he said, his voice attempting a tone of reason, of a leader trying to steer his team through a crisis. "This is obviously a deeply personal and unfortunate situation, but it has nothing to do with the day-to-day operations of this company. We have clients to serve, deadlines to meet. If you want to settle your marital disputes, do it at home. But don't bring this circus into my boardroom." I laughed. A cold, short, humorless sound that startled everyone. "Your boardroom?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a piece of rotten fruit. "I think you're confused, Marcus. A simple review of the acquisition documents will clarify the ownership structure. This isn't your boardroom anymore. It's mine. Which means your personal conduct, especially when it involves the misuse of company funds and a subordinate employee, is not only my business, it is the business." The word subordinate landed with surgical precision. It reframed their affair, stripping it of any romantic pretense and exposing it for what it was, a gross abuse of power. Claire flinched as if struck. She had always seen herself as his partner, his equal. Now, in the stark language of corporate governance, she had been reduced to a line on an org chart, a casualty of his recklessness. Her eyes flickered to him, a silent, desperate plea. I saw in that glance the entire transactional nature of their relationship. He had offered her the thrill of power and status, and she had offered him, what? Adoration? A willing accomplice? An escape from his own life? It didn't matter. The transaction was now void. I finally picked up the file, the physical weight of it a satisfying anchor in my hand. I flipped it open, the rustle of the pages the only sound. "Let's talk about the business, shall we?" I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. Exhibit A, a company credit card statement. A weekend at the Auberge du Soleil in Napa Valley. 2 first-class airline tickets. Billed under Client Relations Development. I've spoken to the client in question. They were in Singapore that weekend. A nervous cough from someone in the back. Marcus's face was a mask of stone. Exhibit B. I continued, turning a page. Conference registrations for a marketing summit in Chicago. 2 attendees. Marcus Thorne, Claire Miller. Full registration fees reimbursed by the company. Odd, then, that the hotel records show you checked out a day before the conference even began. And the conference organizers have no record of either of you attending a single panel. I let the implications sink in. This wasn't just infidelity. This was systematic, documented fraud. "You all thought I was just an oblivious husband," I said, my gaze sweeping the room again, an indictment of them all. "The fool you could patronize at holiday parties while you enabled this culture." My voice remained even, but I infused the word with a quiet disgust. "But let me be perfectly clear. Those days are over. I am not just Claire's husband. I am your employer. And from this moment forward, every single one of you is going to have to decide which side you are on. The side that protected this rod, or the side that is ready to help me rebuild this company with a foundation of integrity." A low hum of whispers erupted. Silent conversations were held with fleeting glances. I saw allegiances shifting in real time. People were physically distancing themselves from Claire, a subtle scooting of chairs, an angling of shoulders away from her. The herd was isolating its weakest member. That was when Claire's despair finally ignited into rage. She slammed her palm flat on the table, the sound making everyone jump. "You can't do this," she shrieked, her voice shrill with desperation. "This isn't your life to control. You can't just walk in here and humiliate me and think you'll get away with it." I looked at her, my expression unchanging. "I don't need to humiliate you, Claire. You've done a masterful job of that all on your own. Every receipt, every lie, every stolen night, it's all documented." I paused. All I did was turn on the lights. Evelyn nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of affirmation. She had likely seen this kind of abuse from Marcus for years, forced to look the other way, to bury complaints, to protect the king. Her moment of liberation had arrived. Marcus, seeing his kingdom crumble, tried one last, pathetic appeal to reason. "We can work this out, Nathan. There's no reason to make this public. Think of the damage to the company's reputation, to the shareholders." I closed the file with a soft, final thud and pushed it back across the table toward him. "The damage isn't from my exposure of the truth, Marcus. The damage was done every time you chose to lie. If you cared about this company's reputation, you would have respected your position. If you cared about your own reputation, you would have honored your vows. You dragged every person in this room into your personal mess. The only thing I'm doing is cleaning it up." The silence that answered him was absolute. Claire's shoulders finally sagged, the fight draining out of her, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell. She looked around the room, her eyes pleading for a friendly face, a lifeline. She found none. I stood, my chair scraping back, the sound unnaturally loud. My shadow fell across the table, across them all. I didn't need to raise my voice. The power in the room had already shifted, gravitating to the center of truth I had created. "This meeting is not over," I said, my tone calm and final. "It is just the beginning. Every decision I make from this point forward will be about the future of this company. That will mean a full audit, a personnel review, and a complete restructuring of the executive team." I let my eyes rest on Marcus. "Some of you will not be a part of that future. And believe me, I will not hesitate." I turned and walked toward the door. As I reached it, I glanced back one last time. Claire was staring at the polished surface of the table, her face streaked with tears, her hands limp in her lap. Marcus's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle pulsed in his cheek, his eyes burning with an impotent rage. The rest of them were statues, trapped in the tableau of their own complicity. As I walked down the silent, carpeted hallway, away from the suffocating weight of that room, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't joy. It was control. For the first time, the lies weren't crushing me. They were crushing them. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was only the beginning. That night, I did not go home to the house that had become a museum of our lies. The air there would be thick with her frantic energy, her desperate attempts to spin a new reality. I drove, aimlessly at first, the city lights blurring into long, neon streaks across the windshield. My phone was a frantic, buzzing rectangle on the passenger seat. A barrage of calls from Claire, then texts, then more calls. Each one was a desperate plea, a furious accusation, a pathetic attempt to regain a foothold. I let it buzz itself into silence. There was nothing she could say that I wanted to hear. She stormed into my office without knocking, slamming the door shut behind her. "You've made a spectacle of me," she hissed, her eyes blazing with a furious, wounded pride. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You think this makes you powerful? You've destroyed both of us." I swiveled in my leather chair, the chair Marcus had sat in just yesterday, and studied her. The expensive dress, the perfect makeup, it was all armor, a desperate attempt to project a strength she no longer possessed. "No, Claire," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through her rage. "You destroyed us. You did it every time you chose to lie instead of tell the truth. You did it every time you looked me in the eye after spending a night with him. This spectacle," I gestured around the office, "is merely the consequence." "You think you're so much better than me?" she spat, pacing in front of my desk like a caged panther. "Sitting there in his chair, with your money and your power. You don't own me, Nathan. You will never own me." "I don't want to own you," I said flatly. "I wanted to love you. But the woman I loved wouldn't have been capable of this. So instead, I will settle for owning the truth. And now I do." The word truth seemed to physically strike her. Her pacing stopped. Her defiant posture wavered. Because she knew, in that moment, that the narrative was no longer hers to control. She couldn't charm it, couldn't cry over it, couldn't manipulate it. The truth was an independent entity now, and it was working against her. She left moments later, her fury dissolving into a sputtering, impotent retreat. Later that week, I convened an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The previous investors, the ones I had bought out, had been largely hands-off. The new board, comprised of my own trusted people, was not. Marcus walked in with a lawyer, his face a grim mask. He thought this would be a negotiation. I didn't speak. I had my legal counsel lay out the evidence, one damning file after another. The financial fraud, the buried HR complaints, the gross mismanagement. My personal life, my marriage to Claire, was never mentioned. It didn't need to be. This was a purely professional execution. The evidence was so overwhelming, so irrefutable, that the board's decision was unanimous. Marcus Thorne was removed as CEO, effective immediately, and a full forensic audit was launched. His severance was voided due to gross misconduct, and he was escorted from the building by security. I didn't feel triumph as I watched him go. I felt a profound, weary sense of justice. Justice for the shareholders he had deceived, for the employees he had mistreated, and yes, for the husband he had wronged. This story was no longer just about a cheating wife. It was about the slow, meticulous process of tearing down a corrupt structure and deciding what to build in its place. And Claire, I knew, was a part of that corrupt structure. Her reckoning was still to come. The removal of Marcus Thorne was not an execution. It was a surgical extraction. The company, which had been shaped in his image, was now a body without a head, and the tremor of uncertainty was palpable. Employees whispered in hallways, their futures uncertain. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and a strange, nascent hope. I was the man who had exposed the rot, but they didn't yet know if I was a healer or simply a new kind of predator. I spent the next few weeks in a relentless cycle of meetings, audits, and strategic planning. My personal life was a distant shore I had no time to visit. The house we had shared was a ghost ship, a place I returned to only to sleep. Claire was there, a phantom haunting its rooms, her presence a constant, low-grade ache. We moved around each other in a state of cold, silent truce. The arguments had ceased. Her desperate pleas had dried up. All that remained was the heavy, unspoken reality of our end. One evening, I came home late to find her sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of wine half empty in front of her. The bravado, the anger, the defiance. All of it was gone, stripped away, leaving behind something raw and unfamiliar. "You've ruined me," she said, her voice flat, devoid of its usual theatricality. It was a simple statement of fact. My job is gone. My friends won't speak to me. My life. It's all gone. All because you wanted revenge. I hung my coat on the back of a chair and leaned against the counter, looking at her not as my wife, but as a problem to be analyzed. "No," I said, my voice steady. "You see this as an act of revenge because your entire worldview is transactional. You did something to me, so I did something to you. But you're missing the point. You weren't just a cheating wife, Claire. You were a co-conspirator in a corrupt system. You benefited from Marcus's abuse of power. You used this company as your personal playground. I didn't ruin you. I just stopped the game." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were different this time. They weren't weapons of manipulation. They were tears of genuine, soul-crushing loss. "What do you want me to say?" she whispered. "That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? That he meant nothing to me?" She laughed, a broken, bitter sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. "Would it even matter to you now?" "It wouldn't matter," I said, and the honesty of it was a cold, clean thing, because it wouldn't be true. "You're not sorry for the betrayal, Claire. You're sorry for the consequences. You're sorry that the world you tried to build for yourself turned out to be a house of cards. You're sorry because for the first time in your life, your charm and your beauty and your clever lies weren't enough to save you." She slammed her hand on the table, the wine sloshing in the glass. "I loved you," she cried, the words torn from her. "Maybe not perfectly, maybe not in the way you needed, but I did. Then you should have chosen me," I replied, my voice quiet but absolute. "When the choice was between our vows and his promises, you should have chosen us. And you didn't. End of story." There was nothing left to say. I walked past her, the sound of my footsteps on the hardwood floor the only sound. I didn't look back. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings. The divorce was swift and clinical. Our assets were divided according to the prenuptial agreement she had signed without a second thought years ago, an agreement that protected the empire she never knew existed. She was left with a comfortable sum, enough to start over, but not enough to maintain the life of effortless luxury she had grown accustomed to. She was, for the first time, truly on her own. At the office, a new culture began to take root. With Marcus and his cronies gone, a sense of relief and possibility began to spread. We implemented transparent financial reporting, a robust and independent HR department, and a zero-tolerance policy for the kind of behavior that had been allowed to fester for so long. Good people who had been sidelined were promoted. The work improved. The morale shifted from fear to a cautious, then confident, optimism. I wasn't just an investor. I was a rebuilder. Months later, the company held an all-hands meeting, a sort of relaunch event to mark the new era. I was asked to give a speech. Standing on a small stage in the company's main atrium, looking out at the faces of hundreds of employees, I thought about the man I was when I first walked into that conference room. A man hollowed out by betrayal, fueled by a cold, singular need for justice. I spoke from the heart, my voice clear and steady. This company has always been built on talent, on creativity, on the hard work of the people in this room. But for a time, it was poisoned. It was poisoned by a culture that valued power over integrity and secrecy over truth. I looked out at the crowd, meeting the eyes of people who had been there, who had witnessed it all. Lies are a corrosive acid. They destroy everything they touch. Marriages, friendships, businesses. But the truth has a different kind of power. It doesn't destroy. It cleanses. It rebuilds. And I promise you, as long as I am here, we will be a company guided by truth. The applause that followed was more than polite. It was genuine, thunderous. It was the sound of a collective exhalation, of a burden being lifted. It was the sound of people believing again. That night, as I left the gleaming office building and stepped out into the cool night air, I thought back to the man I had been. The man who stood before the mirror, his hands shaking as he tied his tie, preparing for a war he never wanted to fight. And then I thought of the man I had become. Steady, unafraid, the sole author of my own life. The story was no longer about her betrayal. It was about my reconstruction. She had tried to tear me down, but in the ruins, I had found the foundation to build something stronger, something better, something that was truly my own. And in the quiet solitude of my new life, I was finally, profoundly, at peace.